all day going down to the store. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and introduce the speaker and the topic for today. We're going to be discussing Hack the Senate with Dwight. I'm going to mispronounce it, Panozzo?
Sounds good to me.
Okay, good. Dwight is an adjunct assistant professor of social work at New York University and a clinician. Oh, you guys are tripping me up with these words today. Clinician in private practice. His social justice work began with gun violence prevention protesting after the Sandy Hook massacre. It included work with the Brady campaign and Gays Against Guns. A problem solver by nature, Dwight recognized that nothing was being achieved at the federal level to stem gun violence, and in particular, the US Senate was the stumbling block. This led him to conceptualize the amalgamation and new state formation process, which lies at the heart of the Hack the Senate movement. So everybody, please welcome Dwight.
Good morning, everybody. It'll just take me a moment to get the tech up and running. Okay, so welcome. First, a little operationalization of terms. We're talking about hacking the Senate. We're not talking about hacking with a meat cleaver, though, although some of us may feel moved to such impulses. We're talking about utilizing a system as it exists, but approaching it in ways not previously conceived of, the way a computer hacker would approach a problem, and find a way to repurpose a system so that it meets our needs instead of its originally intended needs. Now, you might ask, well, most of you probably don't need to ask, why does the US Senate need to be hacked in the first place? So the underlying issue that I would check in on is that the Senate serves to solidify the power of mostly white people who live in very small states and who, unfortunately, tend to oppose evidence-based social policies. So basically, when you oppose those evidence-based social policies, you keep us tied back in the past. You prevent us from moving forward. And when you keep a people tied to a past, tied to practices that do not serve the majority of the people, you oppress them. So let's take a little look at what's going on and why the Senate is basically anti-democratic by design. So as all of you know, every state in the union, all 50 of them, have 2 senators allocated to the state without any reference to the actual population of the state. What this means is that the people living in Wyoming literally have 70 times the voting power of each person living in the state of California. And that's the most gross example of the disproportionality of the Senate. And keep in mind, absolutely no law passes at the federal level without getting through the US Senate. And unfortunately, the current problem is going to get worse. See, the problem is that more and more people live in larger states and fewer people live in the smaller states. By 2040, 30% of the US population will control 70 of the current Senate seats. That leaves 70% of the population only controlling 30 of the seats, right? Of course, all of you can do your math. But this has real world consequences that we can't get away from. And for instance, that I came across recently in the news is that in the CARES Act that passed earlier for coronavirus relief, Wyoming residents literally got 580 times the amount in coronavirus relief per capita that New York residents got. And I hope you'll agree with me that there's something basically unfair about a situation like that. At the end of the day, from my perspective, the people in large states tend to be the servants to the people living in the small states. And quite frankly, if you look back in your history, it's really always been that way. So what does this lead to? Well, as Jessica said, my reason for getting involved in social justice was around gun violence and gun violence prevention. We still have absolutely no reasonable control on guns. Nearly 90% of the US population favors universal background checks for the transfer of all firearms, whether it's in a gun shop or at a through an internet purchase or at a sort of gun swap meet, something like that. But we simply can't get it because we can't get anything through the Senate. Obviously, as you know, we have no universal health care, and we may well in the next few months lose Obamacare as well. We have limitations on voting rights. We have limited rights to personal choice issues such as abortion. Even with the 6-3 majority in the Supreme Court, if a federal bill passed granting abortion rights, we would have abortion rights across the entire 50 states, but we can't do that because of the US Senate as it's constructed. We have no national living wage. And as you know, the list goes on and on and on. And if you wanted a sort of a nutshell of that list, you could look at all of the bills passed by Nancy Pelosi and the House of Representatives since 2018 that were basically dead on arrival in the Senate. Right? The Senate is what keeps us from ever becoming a modern democracy the way all the Scandinavian countries are able to achieve it, basically the way all Northern European countries are able to achieve democracy in the 21st century. So a little history lesson, and I know this is going to be old news to most of you. How did we get here? So the Senate was part of the Great Compromise in the 18th century, right? Unfortunately, the white supremacist dudes who devised it were really interested in protecting their own privilege, their own property rights at the expense of everybody else. And you can include slaves, women, and basically anybody who didn't own land, right? They really had no rights as far as the ruling elite were concerned. And as we all know, they succeeded, and they succeeded magnificently. But from my perspective, their success was really just a deal with the devil. Now, of course, the large population states could not necessarily foresee what the Great Compromise would lead to. They could not foresee that the co-equal House of Representatives really becomes nothing more than a handmaiden to the Senate the moment the Senate, like Mitch McConnell has masterfully done, simply says no to every piece of progressive legislation, right? It goes nowhere. So every time the House passes a bill that goes nowhere in the Senate, it just shows you a failure of our system. Now, this is the second time I've gotten to do one of these presentations, and I believe that each one is going to teach me something. And I wanted to check in with you all on something that I learned from the first presentation. And that's the idea of special pleading. And I know a lot of you are probably steeped in skepticism and could probably name off all of the logical fallacies far better than I could. But the special pleading is a fallacy. And what do we mean by special pleading? We mean the concept of holding forth on the idea that just because I'm from a particular part of the country or I do a particular thing, somehow this makes me better or more important than anyone else. Somehow this sort of gives me the right to have 70 times the voting power of the people of California. And there's a lot of common arguments that go along with this. Things like our rights will be trampled on if we don't have two senators, which is an interesting argument because it completely doesn't look at the fact that because you have those two senators, but very few human beings living in your state, you're the one who's actually doing the trampling right now. It's sort of like how we as white people are so used to not seeing our privilege on a day-to-day basis. It's the same with these special pleading arguments. But I would say, any time that we argue that there is something unique and special about us, that means that we should have more voting power than another human being, we are simply engaged in the fallacy of special pleading. And quite frankly, it doesn't make us look good as human beings. Our grandchildren will not be thrilled to know that we took on these special pleading arguments. That's what I would say about that. So, how do we fix this terrible situation? Well, there's one way I want to rule out right off the bat. That's a revolution. It's the worst possible answer. It leads to terrible situations. Lots of people get killed. And frankly, the people who end up in power tend to be even less interested in the common weal than the politicians who currently have power. Now, here's one that I hear over and over again. Dwight, we just have to change the Constitution. I'm sorry, but are you kidding me? Have you looked deep down at the requirements to change our Constitution? First, you need the 2/3 vote of Congress. But then, the icing on the cake that makes any change in the Constitution around the power structure of the current Senate impossible, you need 3/4 of the buy-in of the states. Do you think for 1 minute that you're going to get those small states who currently wield all that excess power to hand it over? In the history of humanity, power tends never to be handed over voluntarily and easily, right? It's one of the problems of humanity. So here's my solution. Add more states. Lots and lots of air quotey states, okay? And I'll show you in a minute what I mean by the air quotey type of states. Now, some people would also argue, Dwight, once we get Puerto Rico and DC in as states, this will fix the situation, right? All right, first off Jump Street. It is not the job of the Black and brown people living in Puerto Rico and DC to fix the handiwork of 18th century white supremacists. That just looks terrible, right? And frankly, and I am not a legal scholar and I haven't steeped myself in the arguments, but from what I have read at a superficial level, there is no way DC is going to achieve statehood quickly and easily. Frankly, the Republicans expect to be able to tie up the issue of DC statehood in the courts for years. All right. And even if Puerto Rico and DC did become states, the power concentration of the small states would continue to grow because of migratory patterns within the population of the big states getting bigger and the small states getting smaller. So DC and Puerto Rico only amount to a temporary fix to the situation, right? Let's look back at some other stuff that ain't going to work. So you see on the screen a map of what used to be Virginia, and in 1863 became West Virginia and Virginia, right? But we didn't get West Virginia willingly from the Virginians. Basically, the Union stole it from Virginia because Virginia was in open rebellion, right? And the people of West Virginia really did not want to be part of Virginia. They were always really quite different in character. Another classic example is the financier Tim Draper. He's a tech guru. He's out in California, and he's tried 2 different initiatives to try to split California into either 3 or 6 different Californias through a ballot initiative. The California Supreme Court killed it. And frankly, there's some other reasons why Draper's initiative would have failed. Because for one thing, people actually do like the idea of their states. I'm sure most of you sitting out there today kind of like the idea that you're Missourians from the Show Me State, right? There's a level of pride and identity. You probably hold to that. Quite frankly, I've been in Jersey for 29 years now. I love being from a blue state like New Jersey. And I love all the jokes about New Jersey as well. I'm totally down with them. It all works for me, okay? But what people also don't like, they don't like the idea of like hacking their existing state into pieces, increasing taxes, increasing bureaucracy. So we can't just split states apart like Virginia and West Virginia. It ain't going to happen. It's not going to work. But I do want to check in on something about why the concept of states is such a destructive idea in the first place. See, the problem with state is we get trapped within our construct of it. It's state, a state is not a real thing. It's a reification of an idea. It's something that we make out of whole cloth, out of nothingness. And I'll tell you, those white dudes from the 18th century, they were all about their states. Everything was about their state, maintaining the power of their state, maintaining the identity of their state. But as we see now, when people do that, when we reify a simple construct like state, nasty things happen. Nasty things like the US Senate. But let's keep in mind, states do not bleed, they do not feel, and they do not think. Only people can do that, and only in keeping with their actual numbers. When we act as though it's anything other than that, we're actually engaging in a form of subtle cultural delusionality. It's a very bad idea, and it causes a lot of suffering. So let's talk about we hack that there Senate. So we're going to hack the Senate by using the very tools the white supremacists gave us in the first place. We create those air quotey states following their rules, right? But we create those states based on actual population. And by doing that, we create a nearly representative democracy in the process. It's really subtle, but it would work. And we'll get into the details about that. So I call it the new state formation and amalgamation process. And I apologize to Jessica for having flip-flopped on the title. I used to call it the amalgamation and new state formation process until I realized, no, first you create the states and then you amalgamate them. And you might be asking yourself, what on earth is he talking about amalgamate? We'll get to that part, I promise. So first, you divide existing states that want fair representation according to their population. For every 1% of the decennial census population above a core of 1%, you create a new state. I know that's a difficult sentence, so let me parse it out a little bit. So in the case of New Jersey, in the 2010 census, we came up with about 2.34% of the population. New Jersey is ripe to create 2 states out of. Now, I looked up the numbers for Missouri last night, and I am sorry to tell you, but Missouri by the 2010 census had about 1.85% of the US population. So unless Missouri grows a lot in the current census that's just closing out, by the way I've currently defined things, Missouri would not be a candidate to be split in two. So for now, I'm just going to call these two states Jersey and North Jersey. Now, I use those terms, one, because I'm no poet, and so I'm not good at coming up with good names. And two, if you knew Jersey like I knew Jersey, you'd instantly understand that there's the way things are done in North Jersey, and there's the way things are done every place else in the state, right? It's just the way we roll here. So if we did this process, New Jerseyans would continue to have our 12 representatives. 6 would be for Jersey, 6 would be for North Jersey. But here's the big rub. We would gain 2 additional US Senate seats, and we would gain 2 additional electoral college votes. Oh yes, this makes a huge impact on the electoral college, because if you were to take, according to the 2010 census, if you were to take the new state formation and amalgamation process to its fullest conclusion, you would form 47 new states with 94 new senators and 94 new electoral votes. And all of these would be totally based on population. That would be a huge change and would make our government, without any constitutional amendments, far closer to a true democracy. But the secret to the success is the new states amalgamating together to maintain their old identity, right? So obviously you have the burden of meeting the constitutional requirements, and there are a couple. Article 4, Section 3, Clause 1. New states may be admitted by the Congress into this union, but no new state shall be formed or erected within the jurisdiction of any other state, nor any state be formed by the junction of 2 or more states or parts of states without the consent of the legislatures of the states concerned, as well as of Congress. So a couple of things to check in on there. One, Tim Draper's ballot initiative was unconstitutional by definition. It is not the people of California who could split California into 3 or 6 people. It is only the legislature of California with the blessing of the US Congress, and that means the House of Representatives and the Senate. The president has no part in this. You notice that, right? That's part of the Constitution. One more piece that must be met. Article 1, Section 10. No state shall, without the consent of Congress, enter into any agreement or compact with another state. So the easy history around that would be something like the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. Around here, every airport, every seaport, and every bridge and tunnel crossing over the Hudson River is owned by the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, a joint commission that had to have the sign-off of Congress in order to actually come into being. Without the sign-off of Congress, it could not exist, right? Now, how do you roll these constitutional requirements in at the federal level? You have to have what's called an enabling act by Congress, by both houses, right? So the bill that would have to pass would have to allow the formation of new states through subdividing states based on a minimum of 1% of the US population living in each state resulting from the divisions, and that has to be passed by both houses. Also included in the enabling bill, there needs to be permission to enter for these new states to enter into compacts with and only with all states resulting from the division of a particular state to allow for their governance as they see fit, right? And this has to be a blanket enabling act that doesn't specifically list any one state. It's for all states that wish to meet the requirements, right? Or are able to. So now that amalgamation thing, that tying together of these air quotey new states into something resembling their old state identity. You do it through rock solid state constitutions so that all the power of running these new states is vested in an amalgamation government that exactly duplicates the current state government. And in Jersey, that's Trenton. Does anyone out there know our famous motto for New Jersey that's on a bridge in huge 6-foot-high neon letters? I'll tell it to you. New Jersey makes, the world takes. That's just the terribleness of New Jersey right there in a nutshell. The only thing that ends up changing is the name. Instead of the state of New Jersey, you have the amalgamation of New Jersey composed of those poetic names of Jersey and North Jersey, right? Basically, these little air quotey states are shell companies that we create to leverage the US Constitution to devolve power to the people and away from the current US Senate as it's composed. Notice, at the state level, every politician maintains their fiefdom and their power structure. The only people who lose power are the current US senators in states that end up dividing and amalgamating, right? Because instead of, for instance, in California, having the draw of God only knows how many tens of millions of voters, suddenly Dianne Feinstein, who's one of the senators, becomes only one of 2 senators in 11 new mini states within California. So she ain't so important no more. But the job of meeting the needs of the people is met this way. So the rest is kind of a little boilerplatey, to be frank. We translate all state functions into the amalgamation. Every office, every agency, every bureau that was a state function becomes an amalgamation entity. And you use these strong state constitutions in these new states to limit spending outside the amalgamation to some just insanely low level. And the reason you have to have some spending, you have to anticipate that it's going to take months or years for the federal government to react towards the amalgamation instead of towards the individual states, right? You also need to require within the state constitutions that you need some incredibly high percentage of voters in order to leave the amalgamation. And I would say something like 75% of the voters would be necessary in order to leave the amalgamation that they formed, right? Now, hopefully the hack is only a temporary solution, although I suspect if it ever takes place, getting back to an old-fashioned state of New Jersey probably won't happen within my lifetime, knowing how slowly politics runs. I'd say there's basically a few things that we would need to achieve. One would be that there'd be no voting advantage greater than 10%, and maybe others would say that voting advantage should be even lower for anyone living in a particular state. Obviously, we need to abolish the Electoral College, and the election of president and vice president should only be by popular vote. And frankly, remember how I said it was virtually impossible to get a constitutional amendment. If you have these 47 new air quotey states, suddenly it becomes much easier to pass a constitutional amendment, right? Because the power is far more democratically parsed out. So, a few concluding remarks. If we can fix the US Senate, we really do fix the biggest parts of what's wrong with our federal system. And if we can fix that, we really do have the opportunity to realize so many evidence-based policy goals that would enrich the lives of all of us. But you and I and everyone we know was born into a reified concept of state, and day in, day out, we give it glory and we sanctify it as though it were virtually a religion, when it's really just the handiwork of 18th century white supremacists who were really mostly focused on themselves and the people just like them who already held power. Now, if you think this is a lousy idea, my challenge to you, provide a better and faster solution to end the oppressive nature of the US Senate. And if you can't do that, I ask you, what are you really telling us about you and who you really are? Now, when we're done today, if you're down with what I'm talking about, I'd ask you to go and visit hackthesenate.org, join our mailing list, feel free to make a donation, like our Hack the Senate Facebook page, and please follow us and tweet us out on Twitter. Thank you so much for your time. And it's time for some Q&A, so I'm going to stop the share. There we go. Jessica, you're in charge.
Thank you. I did add into the chat for everybody the hackthesenate.org website, just as a reference for everyone. I don't have any questions that have come in through the chat, but Sarah, is everyone able to unmute themselves if they do have questions? Okay, so if you guys have any questions for Dwight about the topic or anything specific, just unmute yourselves and go ahead and ask, and he'll be happy to answer.
Jessica, would you like to sort of traffic control the Q&A?
I'll do my best.
Okay. I see Andy's hand, by the way.
Yeah, Dwight, I think it was a great idea. Basically, the way I look at it, it kind of turns the Senate into a version of the House, which is much more democratic. The best way to do it, but it's, I mean, every way you can possibly think of is going to be complicated and difficult. The easiest way to do it is just to get rid of the damn Senate and just rely on the House. Because like in England, they have the House of Lords, which was kind of set up like the Senate, or the Senate was kind of set up like that, but that doesn't have any power. It all rests with the House of Commons. So all our power, political power, should rest with the House of Representatives. The Senate shouldn't have any role, but unfortunately it does. Your idea is an interesting way of doing it. I don't know whether it'll work, but a couple of things that might be more possible, which could be an interim step. You mentioned them, doing away, or at least having popular vote for the presidency, and doing away with the Electoral College. It's still going to be hard, but I think that would be a great temporary solution.
Andy, that is one of the arguments I hear the most from people I've talked to, and it's a popular one, but I'd like to check in with you on it. From my understanding, there is exactly one way to end the Electoral College and switch to popular vote, and that is a constitutional amendment. And I understand that I always mess up the name. I should literally have it written down on a card in front of me. The National Popular Vote Compact idea, which a number of states have signed on to. Their electoral college numbers, I think, are hovering around 190. I'm totally willing to be wrong about that. But I used to be an advocate of NPV, which purports to not need a constitutional amendment, but there's a deep flaw. And here's the deep flaw. If you have a state that signs on to NPV and then is sort of run by one party, and the vote that year goes to the presidential nominee from the other party, what do you think the party in power in that state is going to do in the, what is it called, the interregnum, the period between the election and the electoral college and the actual swearing in? I think I can tell you exactly what they're going to do. They're just going to withdraw from the NPV, and whoops, all of a sudden those electoral votes don't necessarily go to the candidate who got the most votes across the country. Instead, they'd go to the candidate within that state who got the most votes. So unfortunately, the NPV, I believe strongly, is really built on sand. It's a brilliant idea that's not going to work, I fear. But I'm so glad you brought it up because it is so close to many people's minds. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. Anybody else have any questions? Sarah?
Yeah, so Dwight, were you expecting that it would be reevaluated every census? Is that how you would see the future?
You know, that's an excellent question, and I don't have the detail on it. I would hope that before you get through one or two censuses, you find a way to reorganize the government through constitutional amendment. Because
Okay.
You're right, in the long run, it's a problem. 100 years down the road, it's a problem. Andy's solution, I think, is the best one.
Mm-hmm.
To simply get rid of the Senate, but you can only do that through constitutional amendment. Mm-hmm. So yes, it's definitely only temporary. It's not a permanent fix.
Thanks.
But thank you for your thought on that. Absolutely. There's two
Right.
hands there.
I saw Lee first. No.
Dwight, that's really fascinating. I've not heard anything at all in this vein, and I really appreciate you speaking to us. You hit on something at the very end that I think is really a fascinating phenomenon, that we really have the founding fathers this kind of almost religious adoration for, right?
Yes.
And
oh yes.
And that's so problematic in so many ways.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's going to be a huge hurdle to this effort. It's just that whole idea about, you can't be a politician without constantly stressing how much you revere the founding fathers and the Constitution and that sort of thing, even though we know a lot of people who are elected, maybe even to the Supreme Court, don't really understand the Constitution. But, I don't know if you'd speak a little to that whole idea and how we go about kind of addressing that.
Paulo Freire would have said, the more conscientized we become, the better. Black Lives Matter said it far more eloquently. The more woke we become, the better we become. And Lee, I will take exception. I think there are probably 4 members of the House of Representatives who would have no difficulty calling out the white supremacist founding fathers as white supremacists. And that would be the members of the squad, right? They would do it in a heartbeat. So the more radical, progressive, woke members of the government we have, the more our children lead the way towards wokeness, the more we will be able to stop holding slave owners in reverence. I got to tell you, I was down in Washington last spring of 2019, and it was the first time I was literally disgusted that there was a Jefferson Memorial. I was disgusted that there was a Washington Monument. To me, it just shows how backward and primitive we are in our thinking. Thank you.
Thank you. Jeff, go ahead. You had a question?
Very interesting topic. Thank you, Dwight. This is kind of just a mathematical thing. Have you considered a rounding mechanism? It seems, almost anything like this, you wouldn't, if you get 1% of the population, you'd get one representative. If you get 1.1, you get one. If you get 1.9, you get one. But if you get 2% of the population, you get 2 senators.
So I haven't, Jeff, and one of the reasons I haven't, one, I kept it at 1% because I feared it would become unwieldy if I made it 0.5%. Suddenly you've got easily over 200 senators, and that's just becoming really unwieldy and unstable. Plus, the Constitution dictates 2 senators per state, right? The moment we get into the micro percentages, the harder it's going to become. And I can certainly appreciate that we should make it 0.9% instead of 1%, because that finally brings Missouri into getting 2 states, right? But it is imperfect, and I don't have a good solution for it. And I'm willing for other people to have solutions. Frankly, I'm still waiting for somebody to point out to me, Dwight, for X constitutional reason, this simply can't happen. Unfortunately, nobody has. I'd be able to put down my work and go read the New York Times, right? But I appreciate your idea, and I do not have a good answer to just how to make it more perfect.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I think we have enough time for about 1 or 2. Kimberly, go ahead.
Thank you. Where are you in this journey? And what is the strategic plan for pushing this forward?
All right. So certainly the strategic plan is to await what happens next week. And as long as a particular party that we needn't even mention gets control of the Senate, then it becomes much more an issue of pushing and trying to gain more members. It's utterly useless to approach individual politicians unless you've got 10 and 20 people signing on saying, this is something that we understand, this is important to us, we want you to support this, right? So I'm really at the place of just building out, trying to get more people to join the mailing list and saying, okay, Dwight, when you kind of get this more off the ground, I'm down. Now, if this has struck you and you want to put in more time, oh boy, do I need somebody who wants to pick up the social media part. I am so terrible at social media. Somebody who can spin something on Twitter and Facebook every day or Instagram. Wow, oh, I didn't lock down the Instagram handle. I don't even know if Instagram has handles. I'm so old and primitive. I did lock down the Twitter. I did lock down the Facebook. But that's where I'm at with it, Kimberly.
Lee, I think we need to get Cicely and Elizabeth on board. Those are our teens, early 20s.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Who are woke.
The more woke, the better.
Well, there you go. Well, thank you, Dwight, very much.
Thank you.
Everybody, you can he gave the information for the website, which I put in the chat, and also the Instagram was the same. I believe it was the same, just the at the beginning of it. I'm not an Instagrammer, so I don't really know how all that works, but it's out there for you. So thank you again very much.
Thank you.
One thing I wanted to say, I didn't see all the applause, it's silent applause.
Yeah, thank you.
I didn't see anything come in on the chat for the connection baskets, but of course I did want to take a moment. I'm sure that you all have seen that we lost one of our members this week, Bob, and I'm going to probably mispronounce his name, Zingaro. Hopefully that's it. So that is definitely a loss for us. I know that he was much loved. I think my favorite memory is him and, oh, I cannot remember her name, sweet older lady. But when we had music going one time, they got up and were dancing in the middle of the aisle, and that is just my favorite memory of them. And so I know that he'll be missed, and you can, Ethical Society on Facebook, I know, posted out some information if you want to send a note out. They're taking donations to youth in need as opposed to flowers or anything like that. So please definitely take a look and send a note to them. And yeah, he'll be missed greatly. We did have a couple other chats come in here. So connection basket, Lee, thank you, Lee. Lee says, congratulations to me and Charlie on our marriage. Thank you. Also, oh, and she had mentioned Bob as well. So thank you. Thank you. It looks like Sarah Beth did have, if Missouri could be 2 states, would we agree that the 70 corridor would be one while northern and southern Missouri is the other? Oh, so 70 splitting the state, I'm guessing is what you're saying, north and south. Wait, I would be north then? Okay, I'm okay with that. So I don't see anything else coming in there. So for what's coming up next week on 11/8, I have Losing I, Finding We is our topic. So American Ethical Union Leader in Training, Christian Hayden, which he's been on our platform before, who is doing his year-long internship at the Ethical Society of St. Louis, will be our guest speaker. And then on the 15th, we have Alex Vitali. I'm terrible with names, geez. A sociology professor at Brooklyn College, who will be discussing his book, The End of Policing. Okay, so for that, I'm going to go ahead and end everyone on a quote. This is from Sharon Salzberg. Voting is the expression of our commitment to ourselves, one another, this country, and this world. So with that, I say, please go out and vote on Tuesday. Let your voice be heard.